Pevet Vona, good morning. We're just gonna start with like a reset question. Raise your hand if you love Mudang, the baby hippo. Yeah, there we go. Okay, we love her because she's so cute, but she's so mad, right? That's the vibe for this presentation. So just mentally prepare for that. As was mentioned, my name is Annita Hetoevehotohke'e Lucchesi. I'm a Cheyenne descendant. I live on my homelands in southeast Montana, a few miles off of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and live in many different spaces, academically and professionally. I'm a geographer. I've been a cartographer for more years than I want to admit. I also work as a victims advocate in my community and have worked with survivors of gender violence, police violence, and mostly families of missing and murdered Native people. So have kind of an intersectional approach in that way, being both kind of in and outside academia. And I've also worked for my tribe in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which I'll talk a little bit about that later in this presentation. The title today is Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Cartography for Self-Determination and Indigenous Wellbeing. Let's see. This is what we're going to talk about today, where things have and are still currently going wrong, Indigenous cartographies and kind of a genealogy of what that looks like, Indigenous data sovereignty, specifically within the realm of cartography, why it all matters, and then a little bit on mapping for Indigenous well-being. I'll be honest, my goal was to share more about mapping for Indigenous well-being, but after seeing the day one of this conference, I felt like there was a lot more background context that was needed before we could have that conversation. So I'm going to focus mostly on that today. And it's primarily built off of two articles that I've published a few years back, one called Indians Don't Make Maps, and the other called Spatial Data and Decolonization. So we'll go into both of those, and we're going to talk about the conference specifically and where I think some things are going wrong and how it can be improved. And then at the end, we can talk a little bit about what mapping for Indigenous well-being looks like to me. So a brief summary of where things have and are still going wrong. And I think some of this is kind of, I would hope, common knowledge in terms of cartography's legacy in land dispossession and forced removals of Indigenous peoples, cartography's use in colonial genocide, cartography's use in creating colonial borders that are actively harmful to Indigenous peoples and lifeways, and also like wildlife and all of our non-human relatives that are on our lands as well. Cartography and the way that it's figured into planning and constructing concentration camps and a system of apartheid. So here in the US, and in Canada and in other settler states as well, but I'll just speak to the US today. I think there's a common misconception that Native, like Indian reservations, are a gift that the government gave to us. You can't give us something we already own. So they weren't a gift. They started out as POW camps. We weren't allowed to leave. We weren't allowed to practice our religion. We weren't allowed to hunt our traditional foods or gather our traditional medicines. They were policed by government agents that often traded sexual violence for basic survival items like food or clothing. And they were prisons that we turned into homes because we didn't have a choice. And so that's what I mean by concentration camps and a system of apartheid, which is still very much in place to this day. My community in southeast Montana does not have clean drinking water. We are 2 hours from the nearest affordable groceries. We are 2 hours from the nearest domestic violence shelter or public transportation. It is -40 for months. And many households don't have heat and are burning clothes or trash to stay alive. We have people that freeze to death every winter. These are some of the kind of systematic inequalities that the government has created by creating this apartheid system. And if you've ever been to a place like Montana, or even honestly, Washington is like this too. I used to live here in Washington. And I think Washington likes to imagine itself as really liberal and open-minded and diverse. Eastern Washington is a place where natives go to die. That's how I felt when I lived there. Spokane is absolutely unsafe in every way. And so I did my master's degree at Washington State. My first semester as a master's degree student, the only other Indigenous student in my program was jumped by a bunch of white men and was dragged through a parking lot by his braid, put into a coma. He came out of it, but he had forgotten his dissertation and had to start over. And that was just a few years ago. So I really want to impress upon everyone here that when we talk about these things, similar to Dr. Smiles' example with the Bowman expeditions, this is not old stuff. This is stuff that happened in all of our lifetimes that's still happening now. And I think the other really great example of how the apartheid system has pervaded or continues to pervade settler society here in the US is if you're in a state like Montana, or even I grew up in rural Northern California, which is similar, has a large native population, but it's separate, segregated. And basketball season is the perfect way to see how that plays out. You will not see white families sitting on the same side of the gym as native families. And every sports season, we know there are radio stations that are going to play the highlights of high school basketball games, because when you're in a rural area, that's the fun, cool thing to do. And racist stuff is said every year about children. So that's what I mean by cartography has been used as a tool to create these geographies that we are still living in and are still very active today. Cartography has also been used as a way to legitimate scientific racism against Indigenous peoples. Dr. Smile spoke to that a bit as well. But I think the example that I like to share is that when settlers came to this continent and started interacting with Indigenous peoples and asking Indigenous peoples to map out their territories, Indigenous peoples often used a scale based on travel time rather than a discrete measurement like kilometer or mile. And so settlers interpreted that as Indigenous people just don't have spatial awareness and aren't scientific, don't have a level of accuracy, don't even know their own lands properly. When the reality is those maps were way more accurate than what settlers were drawing. It was just a different scale. And then lastly, cartography, academic exploitation, and institutional erasure and exclusion. This is something that still happens constantly, as Dr. Smiles shared with some really powerful examples, including in their own department. But also here at this conference, Dr. Smiles and I are the only presenters who are Indigenous to this continent. In the entire conference, and the DEI theme is Indigenous. What the heck? This is my Mudang angry face. Where things are going wrong. Day one of the conference, we had 11 speakers referencing their work mapping Indigenous territories and cultures. Only 2 were Indigenous, and none of them were Indigenous to this continent. That's scary. I don't know how that happened. This conference does not have any Indigenous speakers from peoples of the Pacific Northwest, Washington, the Northwest Coast, or Salish Sea. As Dr. Smiles shared, they're Ojibwe, I'm Cheyenne. We are not coastal peoples from the West Coast. We're here as guests and thankful for that, but we can't speak for this region or its cultures or its experiences. No opportunities for conference attendees to learn about local or regional Indigenous cultures, be of service to or engage with Indigenous communities, or take on any action item regarding Indigenous sovereignty or decolonization of cartography. What does it mean to say the DEI theme is Indigenous or Native when the majority of speakers speaking about Indigenous people are white? Most of them are not Indigenous. None of them are Indigenous to this region. And there's no kind of meaningful step forward from that. If the point is to learn, you're learning from people speaking about us and for us, not learning from us. Which ties into a broader experience that I've had as an Indigenous geographer. So early in my doctoral studies, and I'll say that I started my doctoral studies in Canada at the University of Lethbridge and then transferred to University of Arizona. So this experience is from Lethbridge, not Arizona. I had a wonderful experience in Arizona. But I wanted to do maps with survivors of violence in my community, giving them a chance to make art-based maps on their stories of violence and what geographies of safety might look like. The majority of people that I've worked with, like we've asked folks, where do you feel safe? Most of them say nowhere. And certainly that would be my answer as an Indigenous woman and survivor of violence. And so I was really interested in diving into that in more depth and trying to learn from my community on where we could imagine, like how we can even create a future that feels safe, and how we could try to map that or use maps to do that. Well, I had a faculty member write on my drafted proposal, Indians don't make maps, and said that my proposal was really harmful because I was using a colonial technology and like forcing my people to use that technology to tell their stories, which is absurd. White people are not the only people that make maps. And certainly like Western cartography is not the only historic cartography that has ever existed in the history of cartography. But that's what he was taught, enough to where he felt confident to write that on my paper. So I wrote an article called Indians Don't Make Maps with a whole history of all the maps that we create, or at least a sampling of them. And this quote is from that article. I'll read it out, but for me, it really encapsulates my experience as an Indigenous geographer from undergrad all the way up through grad school. Indigenous mapping traditions were not included in any textbook, assignment, or lecture. Throughout my career as an Indigenous cartographer, I have repeatedly received questions and criticism accompanied by claims that mapping is a colonial tool inconsistent with Indigenous cultures. Moreover, much of the academic literature that exists on Indigenous mapping is focused on mapping practices utilizing Western technology in a contemporary context, and posits Indigenous mapping as an appropriation of colonial technology rather than a continuation of Indigenous intellectual innovation or tradition. So I don't even want to say that we have just one kind of whole intellectual tradition around cartography, because there are hundreds of different Indigenous cultures on this continent, thousands throughout the world, and we all have our own unique intellectual tradition of cartography. But that's being completely erased in geography curricula, or even in kind of the standard narrative and story about the field. So I'm here to say, yes, Indians do make maps. That's what the whole article was about. Pretty special ones, but it's been erased, forgotten, woefully ignored, arguably due to the persistent racism and imperial attitudes within the fields of geography and cartography. And this comes down to like what a map looks like, what is considered Indigenous or not, what's considered scientific or not, and then also like, it was a lonely experience being an Indigenous student in geography programs. There were not faculty that understood my lived experiences. Eventually, I found faculty that empathized with them, and that was enough to get me through, and they were wonderful, but it took me like 6 years to find them. It's why I transferred programs. And I was alone. My master's program, the only other Indigenous student was attacked by a mob. My PhD program in Canada, the only other Indigenous student was an elder from a local community who really struggled to progress in their degree once their niece was found murdered on the street. The department did nothing to acknowledge it, and did nothing to acknowledge his traditional responsibilities as a relative to that person, or the impact that it might have on his studies and how he's able to show up in the classroom. And it was really traumatic. So it's hard to imagine how we can carve out space for Indigenous geography when actual Indigenous geographers are not invited to the table and are often not just unsupported, but actively neglected or traumatized by their experience of academia. So in the article, Indians Don't Make Maps, I wanted to lay out kind of a sampler of what an Indigenous cartographic genealogy would look like. And I started with some examples of ancestral mapping. And so these photos, the top photo is Mau Pialog, who's a Micronesian cartographer and is credited for, excuse me, for revitalizing or being foundational in revitalizing Polynesian wayfinding. And then the photo underneath is the Shoshone map rock, which is in Idaho and is petroglyphs. So this kind of category of mapping I'm describing as practices that are gifted to us by our ancestors in order to continue our relationships to land. It always kind of seemed crazy to me when people said, like, Indians don't make maps, because maps are fundamentally stories about the land and relationships on the land. And part of being Indigenous is like everything is connected to land. What do you mean we didn't tell stories about the land? Ridiculous. So these are some examples of kind of like what I see as, I don't want to say pre or post-colonial because I really want to reject that timeline and want to reject centering colonialism and how we think about our work. But this to me is more about like existing outside colonialism. Like, this is who we are. This is how we've done things, how our ancestors have done things, and how we maintain our relationships with the land, and like not just relationship, but responsibilities to the land. Part of being Indigenous is like, I have a friend who says it like Indigenous, the stereotypes of Native people as being like free earth children is funny because we have so many rules. Our cultures are really strict and have like lots of protocols to them and a lot of responsibilities. Being Indigenous comes with responsibilities and obligations. To me, like, I don't have a right to be Cheyenne, I have a responsibility to be Cheyenne. And this form of mapping is part of how we do that. Another example is these carved wooden maps made by Inuit map makers that align up with ice flows and coastlines. The next category that I created is anti-colonial mapping. So these are maps that like do directly confront colonialism and ongoing land dispossession. So this is a portion of the Codex Quetzalcoatlin, which documents Indigenous land holdings in the face of like encroaching Spanish colonization. And is a way of utilizing maps to, again, maintain relationships with land in the face of dispossession and violence. These are other examples from a map maker from my own tribe, John Crazy Mule, and he was imprisoned by the U.S. government, forced to work as a scout, and created maps documenting the Cheyenne removal from Montana to Oklahoma, as well as the Chief Joseph's band attempting to escape to Canada and then eventual capture by the U.S. government. They're really cool maps that show the Indigenous perspective of the Indian Wars, which, you know, I think people like to pretend that like maps like this don't exist, but they do. And it's a really special way of understanding what was going on at the time. He also mapped Lakota refugee routes as refugees were fleeing the U.S. government and after multiple massacres, which, you know, that kind of information isn't documented anywhere else. So these are really precious. Last category is decolonial mapping. I apologize for the big long quote. But essentially, this category is where I see my work because I was trying to think of like, I'm doing work that is undoing the harm done to my body, my family, my tribe, my land, my people, but I also don't want it to exist in relationship to colonialism. I want it to stand on its own 2 feet and be exactly what it wants to be without having to be underneath any kind of label. So just to read a portion of this out, we are grounded in ancestral knowledge and unapologetically Indigenous without holding ourselves to anyone's standards on what is traditional enough, modern enough, Indian enough, educated enough, or scientific enough. We Indigenous people and the decolonial maps we create are not the clashing of 2 worlds of opposites. We are whole beings traversing the spaces between and through disparate realities that are layered over shared geography. So we are who we are regardless. Like, I'm Cheyenne, whether I'm here in Washington or in Montana. The things that I create are Cheyenne, whether they're created utilizing traditional items or colored pencils, or I like drawing maps in Adobe Illustrator. That's okay. Maggie Walters, who's an amazing Indigenous sociologist, has written on this at length, and how software, like she's talking about statistics and things like that. Software doesn't make it less Indigenous. It's a tool. Like, if you were building a house and you were using a hammer, like if you're building something that's incorporating Indigenous value systems and methodologies that's in service of Indigenous people, even if you use a hammer, like it's still, cultures around the world have all had different forms of a hammer or a mallet, right? Like, it doesn't make it less Indigenous. It's just a tool, and it depends on how you use it. So this is an example of a map I made during COVID. And it's all the places that I sent text messages in like a week, I think, across the Indigenous world in their place names, to show that even during quarantine, the Indigenous world is highly connected. That's the other thing about like research protocols in our communities. Everybody knows each other. You are not going to mess up an Indian country and get to come back hoping that another person hasn't heard about it. Like, Dr. Smiles and I are from completely different tribes. I would bet $10 we're like 10th cousins or something. Because my people used to live by the Great Lakes too. And so that's, like, this map is trying to kind of acknowledge that in a modern sense. These maps are life paths of murdered Indigenous women in Thunder Bay and Montreal. And we don't have time to go into them in depth, but just to give you kind of a few takeaways, this map right here is actually like upside down because it's the view of southern Quebec as Inuit people from the north looking down, and is looking at the stories of murdered Inuit women in Quebec who are targeted because they're Inuit, because they were brought to Montreal to access healthcare that's not available by the Canadian government in their home communities. One of them was attacked by a polar bear, which is becoming more common due to climate change. And so the maps are kind of refusing blame on these women themselves for their deaths, and looking more at how colonial systems create geographies that Indigenous women are forced to navigate that make them targets for harm. So it's about shifting a narrative of vulnerability or blame into a narrative of like colonial geographies and being targeted. Like, we're not vulnerable, we're targets. And then this is a map I created in partnership with Braveheart Society, mapping data on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how it might intersect with the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. This was created a few years ago before Biden shut down plans for the pipeline. But I think what's unique about it is not necessarily the aesthetic, but the data itself. The data that we had on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases throughout the region was based on our own grassroots efforts to collect it. It's not from any formal law enforcement or governmental data. And because of that, we were able to gather much more rich data than anything the government would provide. So for example, how many cases had a non-native perpetrator and what the likelihood was of prosecution or conviction in those cases. And even how many cases are not in the appropriate law enforcement databases. So for example, 1 in 2 white male killers are never charged or convicted, and over 3/4 of missing Native women and girls in the region aren't in the federal missing persons database. So this was really about using a map to showcase the richness of community data, and in an effort to try to protect us from further harm from extractive industries. I wanted to close this section with a brief, incomplete list of contemporary Indigenous geographers. You'll see me and Dr. Smiles on there, but there's also a lot of other folks who are doing really amazing, unique, cool work. I hope they were all invited. I hope they all just turned it down because they didn't feel like coming, which is still sad. Like, NACIS still needs to figure out why they turned it down. But there are a lot of us out there, and we aren't that hard to find, and we all know each other. So if you had asked one of us, like, hey, we need a list of 5 other people to invite, Dr. Smiles and I think probably know everyone on this slide, or just about. And so would have been happy to make those introductions or those recommendations. So there is not a lack of Indigenous geographers out there. We are there, and we're well networked, and ready to show what we're working on. So the next part of the presentation, I want to talk about data sovereignty. And again, it's based on this article, Spatial Data and Decolonization. This photo in the background is from the Camp to Protect Mauna Kea. I was invited to visit the camp by elders a few years ago to discuss documenting missing and murdered Kanaka women and how that intersects with their efforts to protect sacred sites and homelands. And so a lot of what I wrote in the article were things that I learned or observed in camp. And I discussed that at length in the article. But one thing in particular that was really inspiring to me was every day in this part of the road, they would do protocol, and all the new visitors to the camp would have to come and introduce ourselves, share where we come from, who our people are, and provide, like myself and the other women that I was there with, we gave traditional jewelry to the elders, like traditional to our tribe, and sang one of our women's songs during protocol. And there's just an extremely high level of diplomacy and like an Indigenous sense of diplomacy that was there. And that really inspired me to think about what Indigenous data sovereignty or research methods looks like from that lens of diplomacy and protocol. And I should mention that's also inspired by Leanne Simpson. She has a quote that an Indigenous definition of a border is a space of increased diplomacy. And so that was also something kind of rolling around in my mind during that time. I think you've gotten a really great overview of Indigenous data sovereignty, but just know there's a lot of amazing publications out there and some really cool groups, global and regional. So you'll see some of them here: GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, which is based at University of Arizona, and then a few more outside of the U.S. So there's lots of resources and lots of opportunities to learn. And most of the scholars in these groups publish open access. So no excuse. Like there's a whole giant, like multiple 100-page book on Indigenous data sovereignty that's free for download. So go learn. Part of Indigenous data sovereignty is also kind of responding to or in relationship to the open data movement, which at times has very different priorities around data. So the open data movement kind of champions the FAIR principles, which is that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, created this graphic to say that, yes, and Indigenous data should also address collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, which I think, DeAndre, Dr. Smiles gave some really good examples of what that looks like. So my question became, how does our research change when we shift our perspective from one characterized by the academic and institutional expectation of Indigenous consent to one grounded in Indigenous data sovereignty? So like Dr. Smiles mentioned with the Indigenous Futurities Lab, it's not about like going into a community and saying, hey, we want to do this work, is that okay with you? It's about like being there as a resource so communities can come to you and say, hey, we want to do this work and we need your help with it. So how do we move from, getting consent is very important and is also something that should be part of the process. But I think like more broadly, it's not enough. It's not enough on its own. And that's what I was thinking about when I was writing this article. So 4 parts. They're kind of kindergarten rules in the titles, but that's meant to make it really accessible. First rule, be respectful. So follow the protocols of the specific community you intend to do research with. Don't travel to an Indigenous community for research if you're not willing to connect with the land solely in a manner that the community feels appropriate. And like an example of this is there's a tribe where I live in Northern California that fishes for lamprey eels. But they have rules that only men fish for lamprey eels and only women clean and process them. And they allow non-tribal members to fish for lamprey eels, but they ask that you respect that protocol and those rules. They don't explain it because they don't have to. It's just, that's the rule. If you're there doing research, I don't care if you're doing research on like, I don't know, breast cancer statistics or something entirely unrelated to fishing for lamprey. Doesn't matter. If you decide to, go fishing for lamprey, follow the rules, even if it's recreational and outside of the scope of your research. Understand that you may be asked to create works that are not for public distribution or any kind of publication, and view those moments as gifted experiences of trust, not roadblocks to publication. In my experience, there are always a path forward to some sort of presentation or publication, but sometimes it's not the actual work product that community wants. It's the process of how you did it, or the process of how you built the relationship. Like, the more trust you build, even if it's something you can't share out, the more opportunities there are for other things down the line. Rule number 2, be aware. Don't go to an Indigenous community for research without previously extensively researching the history and ongoing legacies of violent colonization as it affects that community in specific. Be willing to acknowledge that open source platforms could compromise the community's data sovereignty, inform them of that, and be willing to explore alternatives and think creatively. Understand that the community has a fundamental right to own the data on their lands and people. Just because you gather it doesn't mean it's yours. So for example, I make maps for my tribe's historic preservation office. I'm not going to show you any of them today because they're not mine. I mean, I made them, I did all the research for them, I worked as a contractor to create them, but they belong to my people. And they're not for distribution in a place like this. They're for the office to take care of our lands and our cultural items. Rule number 3, be humble. Don't assume the community you are intending to do work in doesn't already have someone capable of doing the work. This happens a lot. I can't tell you how many times as a gender violence advocate, I've had geographers reach out to me and be like, have you ever thought about mapping this? Like, I could help you map it. I'm like, well, I have a PhD in geography and I've been a cartographer since 2011. So yeah, I have thought about it. If you're coming to research any of our stories or knowledge, you have a responsibility to develop the competence to do it in a respectful way. Don't assume that Western styles of data analysis or tools like GIS are useful or desirable. I hand draw all my maps. If you have to use GIS, fine. Trace it in Illustrator and finish it hand-drawn. I think there are so many ways of thinking that GIS can't currently accommodate. And then lastly, don't expect an academic publication, again. 4th, be helpful. Do not solicit Indigenous people to participate in a project they didn't ask for. Create opportunities to help in building capacity of the community, as Dr. Smiles mentioned, like making sure the work can outlast your relationship with that community. And work to circumnavigate and remove institutional barriers that make it difficult to put Indigenous data sovereignty into practice. So to recap, be respectful, be aware, be humble, be helpful. Kindergarten rules, not that hard. Why is this so important? Here's I want to give an example of the risks with a case study of mapping treaty lines. Please don't map treaty lines if you don't know what you're doing. I heard something yesterday about it and it was really disturbing to me. And I want to explain why. Most treaty boundaries, or a lot of them, are based on natural feature boundaries. Rivers, streams, coastlines. Those change over time. Treaties are old. Are we going to follow the river's path from 200 years ago or now? Are we 50 years from now or 100 years from now, after climate change has changed everything because of all these extreme weather events, are we going to follow the river's path then or from 300 years? It's complicated. A lot of tribes have become confederated or combined, migrated over time, or been relocated, or have been renamed over time by anthropologists, or have reclaimed their own name for themselves. And being aware of those changes is really important when wading through historical documents. As we know, mapping technology has changed drastically over time, and the technology that was available in the 1830s is not the same as today. So the accuracy is different today than it was in the 1830s. And that's something that has to be accounted for if you're trying to map a treaty line today. And it leads to legal questions about reconciling historical maps. So I think the shifting river path is an example, or also even like a lot of treaty boundaries are also using meridians. So let's say there was a map created in the 1850s of the treaty lines following a meridian, but the meridian wasn't plotted properly because they weren't as accurate as they are today. Do we use what was customarily used based on that map that's over 100 years old? Or do we use what matches the more precise instruments we have today? That's never been debated in a court, as far as I know. Issues of projection and scale, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but your maps change. It changes based on what projection you use and what scale you use. And that also has potential to shift what the boundary looks like. And then lastly, bureaucratic standards regarding accuracy. Most agencies have like a accuracy level of 30 feet. So like it's accurate plus or minus 30 feet. If you have a bounded area that's a 50 mile by 50 mile square, and you're using that plus or minus 30 feet, that means there's over 700 acres of gray zone in that buffer area. So sometimes the issue of like land back is as simple as that mathematical equation and understanding the kind of bureaucratic standard. So it's messy, it's complicated. It requires somebody who knows this kind of stuff and how to navigate it. And everything is at risk when you do it because these maps can and will be used in court, whether you know it or consent to it or not. Native people are still actively fighting for our right to our land, water, wildlife, cultural sites and practices. And it plays out in courtrooms, and courts will and attorneys will casually introduce maps without stopping to ask, did the cartographer ask themselves all these questions? And then those maps are used to determine where that treaty line should fall, which can determine cultural and like literal actual survival of our peoples. When you think about like the mental health impact of not being able to hunt or gather in our traditional places, and also knowing like the poverty rate in my community is extremely high, the hunger rate is extremely high. As a victim's advocate, I fill grocery orders every day because there's people starving every day. So if the treaty line gets misinterpreted and now there's an area where we can't hunt and gather where we're used to doing that, you've denied our community a pretty critical resource for survival. Which boils down to like the big words here. Indigenous lands, peoples, waters, cultures, and stories are not for fun projects. They are not something you do because it's something that sounds interesting to you. They are something that is done for literal survival of our people and our rights. My tribe has, I think, about 15,000 enrolled members, and maybe a third of them, or a little over a third, live on the reservation. Imagine coming from a people that only has 15,000 people in existence. Imagine living in a 5,000 person community where we have a murder at least once a month. As a victims advocate, I have buried 4 child murder victims this year. I am literally one of the people burying the bodies. I don't have time for projects that are for fun, neither do our people. And it's not something to take lightly. It's not something to jump into because you think that you can. It requires long-term relationships and a lot of expertise because our people are dying. And MAPS are actively involved in that, both in complicity, but also in prevention. Benefits of doing this, a little less scary. Doing this kind of work in a good way brings people together through dialogue about the land and places of significance, teaches us to share and honor our differences, and it's one of the most literal paths to decolonization. We can't talk about decolonization without talking about land, and maps are bound up in that. Not just like literal actual land and the maps and how we draw the land, but like how we think about land, what our epistemologies and axiologies are, how we interact with it, what kind of spatial relationships we see ourselves in. And it requires an actively decolonizing framework that centers Indigenous political sovereignty, land title, and self-determination. So it's not just about like following the kindergarten rules. It's about understanding that there's lives at stake, there's land at stake, like, and more than human lives, wildlife lives, plant lives. And that's the beauty of it. You can be part of resurgence, you can be part of revitalization if you do this well. So what can NACIS be doing? Invite speakers from peoples indigenous to the region where the conference is taking place. Provide opportunities for conference attendees to learn more about colonialism and cultures from this area. Implement the 80% rule, which is what I follow. I don't participate in a project in Indigenous communities that doesn't have 80% Indigenous leadership. I'm not talking staffing, I'm not talking advisory board, I'm talking leadership. All these projects we've heard about in Indigenous communities should have Indigenous co-authors from those communities who are here speaking. I don't know why that's not happening. Consistent, adequate funding to support Indigenous participation, consistent land acknowledgements, provide conference attendees with a suggested list of action items. For example, when I travel to someone else's territory, I make a monetary donation to an Indigenous community in the area. Or if the tribe doesn't take money directly, I donate to an Indigenous serving organization because it's part of being a good guest. Like if you come over to somebody's house for dinner, you bring a bottle of wine, right? Or bread or something. Like I'm here as a guest, so I'm gonna bring something. Make Indigenous representation more than a DEI theme, and dedicate a seat on the NACIS board for Indigenous leadership, hopefully more than one, but at least one. This is a quote from the article. I realize we're running low on time, so I'm just gonna kind of skip through it so we can talk about mapping for Indigenous well-being. These are photos from my homeland. The horse in the bottom left is one of my Mustangs. Her name's Blossom. I just found out she's pregnant. I'm very excited. And these are some of our traditional plant medicines. So as I mentioned, I grew up in rural Northern California, so I did not grow up on my homeland or in my community, and reconnected as an adult and have been learning my culture as an adult. And it's been such a beautiful experience to get to do that through working at the TIPO office, participating in cultural events and ceremonies, and by being of service to my community as an advocate. And I'm also fortunate my tribe, similar to Dr. Smiles, has its own tribal college where I've been able to take language and botany classes and things like that. So what I've been working on now is maps of our homeland and of our stories that's useful to TIPO and to the tribe, but also that are healing for me as a reconnecting survivor. And like I'm very public. I'm a survivor of human trafficking and other forms of violence like police violence. And so I came to my community with a lot of baggage and trauma, as well as my family's trauma around disconnection. And the process of mapping became more important than the maps themselves because it put me back on my land. It put me in good relationships with people in my community. It gave me an opportunity to be of service to my people. And that was immensely healing for me. So when I talk about mapping for Indigenous well-being, I'm talking about the process of mapping, not even necessarily the end result. And for me, that brings us to a bigger question of what if we reimagine cartography as a practice that facilitated Indigenous land reconnection, lifeways, safety, and healing? What if we got to make maps about something other than violence or colonialism? How awesome would that be? That's my goal for my current and future work. And I'll end with, these are some more photos of our plant medicines and Blossom and some of this stuff from my culture, our language. These are mapping these things and mapping these stories has been so immensely healing to me that my next goal is to be able to return to that initial project where I was told Indians don't make maps, which is how do we create a healing, how do we create mapping as a healing process for survivors of violence in my community and other Indigenous communities as well. So I'm experimenting with myself as a survivor and a reconnecting person with healing to do. And it's been awesome. So that's the future direction of the work when we're done correcting all of the harms. Here's how to contact me. feel free to reach out. Would love to talk to folks. I realize we don't have a whole lot of time for questions, but maybe a little bit. And thank you for listening and putting up with my Moodang experience today.
Thank you so much, Annita.